Hi there, this is my video journal number 3 where I'll be discussing the behavioral characteristics of ASD that I have observed thus far. I will also talk about interventions used to address those behaviors and if they seem to be effective and what I observed. For my observations, I continued observing the 8th grade student in our mild to moderate program. Student A, what I'll call him, is fully included in all his general education classes and receives specialized academic services in the form of push-in and pull-out in the group setting during elective time. In order to observe different behavioral characteristic, student B that I've also been observing doesn't tend to show a lot of outward behavioral stuff. So I observed 2 other students, a 5th and a 6th grader in our specialized teaching program, which supports students with moderate to severe needs. They also spend the majority of the time in a small group or in pull-out. And when they do push into the gen ed classroom to electives or general education classes like history, they often have a paraprofessional with them. I will refer to them as student C and student D. One of the first behaviors that I observed in student A would appear to a lot of teachers like defiance. He was in his math class and he had his head down. He was refusing to wear his mask, wear a disposable mask I was giving, and he was also refusing to do any work and really wouldn't respond to any teacher redirection. The teacher offered him a cloth mask because in the past he had a behavior where he ripped his disposable mask because he didn't like the feel of it. But even with the cloth mask, he refused it. Then the education specialist asked him if his basic needs were met. Like, did he eat breakfast that morning? Did he get enough sleep? Did he need to take a break or eat a snack? These questions were asked because of knowledge of the student. Sometimes we see the most behaviors when he's hungry or he's tired. He also has a tracker, so the teacher tried to remind him of his tracker where he's earning points for completing his work. But this was also met with silence and head down. So none of the interventions seemed to be effective at that point. At this point, I texted mom to see if everything was okay and to see if anything had happened before he came to school that day. It turns out that they had returned from a long trip the previous day and he hadn't really slept that much. So he finally did perk up at the end of the day and stayed after school to finish the work that he didn't get done earlier. And as a result of intervening with mom and communicating with parents, he went to bed early that night, and the next day it was a complete 180. He was reinvested in his tracker. He was completing most of his work. For this one, the regular interventions that we had tried before with this student didn't work, where in the past they had. But thankfully, with getting a basic need met like sleep, his behavior chart started working again, and that worked well. Another behavior that I observed in student A was a social interaction with one of his peer friends that didn't go too well. He took a new book that his peer had gotten and hid it from her. And even when she was asking where it was, he didn't say anything. Eventually, the other student found out and got really upset, and she stopped talking to student A. So this put him in a bad mood and upset him, and he wasn't sure what to do. As a part of a grade level intervention, the team used social stories and video models about appropriate friendships and relationships and friendships. And student A watched the video in the morning and then approached me later in the afternoon and said he wasn't sure how to fix it, but he had messed up with his friend. So I modeled some words that we could use when we make a mistake. He practiced using the words, and then in a controlled setting with myself and the other student, he was able to apologize. And so I feel like the interventions of seeing the video, then seeing the live model, and then finally practicing really gave him the tools to apologize on his own and repair that social relationship. For the observation I did of student C, I did it in 2 different classes. First, I observed him in his history class where he had a paraprofessional with him, and then in his pull-out math class. In history, he was sitting in the back of the class next to the para. After a little work on the computer, it seemed like he was getting fidgety, so he took a break to the bathroom. When he returned, he got back on the computer, and again, he was pretty fidgety. He was playing with a pipe cleaner, kicking his legs around. At one point, he was hanging out of his chair. So the para wrote a note on the whiteboard with a checklist of what he needed to get done. And I think that visual intervention was enough to get him refocused. He also had a laminated tracker on his desk that he keeps with him all the time. And he can earn stars for keeping quiet voice or completing his work and for following directions. And so I think that redirection to that enabled him to get back on track. When I observed him later in his math class, they were doing a preferred activity on his favorite reflex math program. So there were no outward behaviors, but I did get to see how his behavior tracker was reinforced, because at the end of that time, he earned enough stars to watch a choice YouTube video, which is Minecraft for him. So that was that behavior tracker intervention seems to be working well for that student. And then I observed student D also in 2 different classes. First, I observed her in her lab, her computer lab class, where she didn't have a paraprofessional, but there are 2 teachers in that class. She was working on a computer program, which is a preferred activity for her. She was making a lot of noises, showing the behavior characteristics of noises, flapping her hands, but it didn't appear to be distract anyone. She was sitting in the way back, and all the students had headphones on. So there was no redirection for that behavior. When it was time to clean up, she didn't close her Chromebook, but instead went over to the hand sanitizer and continually pumped it and just put a lot in her hands. The second teacher did do a one-on-one intervention with her. She redirected her back to her desk, where there was a visual schedule for that particular class on her desk. And so the visual schedule allowed her to see what time it was and what needed to be done. So that was an effective intervention for her. In her art class, she didn't have a paraprofessional either, but her desk was strategically right next to where the teacher teaches. So she could redirect her when necessary and have that closeness, that proximity. In this class, I observed the behavior extreme and narrow interests. Her favorite color is pink, and that is the only color she wanted to use for her activities. So the teacher ended up offering her a choice of marker or colored pencils, but it had to be pink. And she also has a sticker chart, and all of that is pink. So it's everything is pink, and sometimes when their pink isn't an option, that can bring about other behaviors. But the art teacher did comment that it helped her stay calm, and for the activity they were doing, only one color was fine. So that ended up being okay. But those are just some of the behaviors I observed in the students and the interventions. And like I said, some interventions are consistent and they work a lot, but with my first student, interventions that worked in the past didn't work the next time, and you kind of had to try something different in order for his needs to get met. So thanks very much.